That's a P12. Charge on, and difficult to pass there with the DRS. And pick up, please. And 3 out, the pace was very good.
Really sorry about this weekend, guys. For losing you points.
Can a single phrase on the radio reveal the internal collapse of one of the most anticipated alliances in the history of F1? Lewis Hamilton has said something that many in Ferrari did not want to listen, and could change everything. The 2025 Hungary Grand Prix will be marked as a before and after in the modern narrative of Formula One, not by a track maneuver, but for what was said after the traffic lights. Lewis Hamilton, with more than 300 large awards behind him and 7 world titles, launched one of the most disconcerting statements of his career. Always, I'm only useless. Absolutely useless. It was not a technical complaint, it was not a claim for strategy. It was a public confession, issued by the radio of the team live, before millions of spectators. It was the emotional collapse of a legend within the cockpit of a team that was supposed to be his last great challenge. But this moment cannot be analyzed as a simple phrase out of context. It is the visible manifestation of a deep and progressive conflict that has been accumulating from the same moment when Hamilton signed by Ferrari. Since his arrival, there was a hopeful speech. The experience of the British pilot added to Ferrari's technical muscle would build a winning pair. However, after months of pre-season tests and the first dates of the calendar, the distance between that illusion and reality has become painfully evident. And Hungary was the breakdown. What most surprised was not his criticism of himself, but what he said immediately after. The team has no problems. They have seen that the car is in pole, so they probably need to change pilot. This line is not only a self-accusation. It is a direct attack, a signal towards the Ferrari wall, towards its engineers, to those who make decisions. In that phrase, a gigantic emotional burden is implicit. The feeling that it is not being heard, that the team does not revolve around him, but that he is the one out of tune. That the car works but not with him. And that gap between pilot and car, between pilot and equipment, becomes a difficult well to reverse. Formula One is a symphony of details. If only one of those items defies, the performance falls apart. In this case, the dissonant element is not the car. It is the emotional and technical connection between the pilot and the machine. Hamilton is not fighting the other pilots, even against Leclerc. He is fighting the SF25. He is struggling to feel part of the project. The moment is especially painful if the contrast is considered. In that same qualifying session, his partner Charles Leclerc achieved pole. It was not a miraculous or lucky pole. It was a perfect turn, executed with a car that seems designed for their hands. Leclerc has not changed style. Leclerc has not had to adapt. And that exposes, with a brutal rawness, the mismatch between the car and Hamilton. It is not that the SF25 is not competitive. It is not a car for Hamilton. At this point, the narrative that fed so much the press and the Hamilton fans closing his career with Gloria in red Ferrari begins to crack. Because what we see is not the construction of a legend. It is the process, perhaps inevitable, of a live disconnection. And when that disconnection is verbalized so explicitly, the question is no longer whether Hamilton can adapt. The question is if you want to keep trying. Because Hungary 2025 GP was not just a sports defeat. It was an alarm signal. A call for help. Or maybe, the first step towards an earlier separation of what no one dares to admit. Technical analysis after each session have been consistent. The SF25 has an intrinsically unstable balance. What this means in practical terms is that the car does not behave the same in a high-speed curve than on a decline. It does not stop the same in a fork than in a chicana. It does not transmit the same sensations between one lap and the next. For a pilot like Hamilton, whose driving is based on muscle memory, in anticipating the behavior of the car and millimetrically adjusting his trace, this is a nightmare. And it is deeper than a matter of tuning. The problem is in design philosophy. Ferrari has developed a car that maximizes aerodynamic efficiency in curve, but does it at the expense of a stable base. Charles Leclerc, who has been an active part in this process from the beginning, understands and dominates it. But Hamilton meets a car that demands inputs other than those he has used throughout his career. What for Leclerc is natural, for Hamilton it is a constant correction. And in the modern Formula One, where the differences are measured in thousandths of a second, that micro-insecurity is transformed into an insurmountable disadvantage. Another aspect that has aggravated the situation is that Ferrari has not yet developed an alternative configuration to adapt to his new pilot. Everything in the car revolves around Leclerc. Power maps, balance simulations, even aerodynamic load profiles. Hamilton is literally driving a car designed for another pilot. And what is worse, for another type of pilot. And this is not solved with an update or an emergency configuration. It requires a technical reorientation. It requires investment, time, and will. But in a season where Ferrari needs immediate results, are they really willing to redesign half a car to adapt to a pilot who is in his last sports stage? One of the central points in that narrative was the expected update of the rear suspension. According to Ferrari engineers, this modification not only sought to improve the traction at the curve output, but also to offer a more stable platform under braking, precisely two of the areas where Hamilton had shown more difficulties. The simulations indicated that the improvement in dynamic stability would be substantial, and the Hungaroring circuit, with its sequence of low and medium speed linked curves, seemed the ideal place to prove it. But when the new pieces were placed in Hamilton's car, the result was disappointing. Not only did he find palpable improvements, but the car became more unpredictable. The softer suspension at the end of the rear axle changed the balance that was already problematic, aggravating the instability that he had criticized so much. Ferrari had promised a structural solution, but delivered a cosmetic correction. And Hamilton, who had been insisting that the car did not allow him to attack, he simply sank even more in his frustration. To this is added a much deeper problem: the chronology of development. Ferrari began working at the SF25 since the summer of 2024, and during that process, Charles Leclerc was the absolute reference. Its feedback defined the first versions of the car, its suggestions molded the motor maps, the base adjustments, and even the progression of the updates. When Hamilton joined the team, the car was already designed. Ferrari did not develop the SF25 with two pilots in mind. He developed it with one. And that is paid today. This imbalance is even noticeable in the small details. While Leclerc feels increasingly comfortable and solid as the season advances, Hamilton has not been able to consolidate a technical basis on which to build its performance. Each new evolution seems to distance it from the car. Each improvement for the team represents a greater disconnection for him. And that is the most dramatic, that even when Ferrari advances, Hamilton goes back. Not because he does not have the talent, but because the car does not speak to him in the language he knows. In addition, simulator sessions are not yielding the expected fruits. Ferrari has invested in detailed simulations to understand Hamilton's problem, but the data that emerge do not translate into real sensations on the track. The engineers see it in the graphics, but he does not feel it in the seat. And in modern Formula One, that disconnection between data and perception is a hard barrier to overcome. To this we must add the political pressure within the team. Ferrari is a hierarchical structure with marked loyalties, and although Hamilton's signing was backed from the General Directorate, the daily operation continues to revolve around Leclerc. There is no unlimited time or resources. And in a championship as tight as that of 2025, each technical decision counts. If you have to choose between evolving for Leclerc or redesign for Hamilton, the priorities have become evident. They have been counterproductive. What should be an adaptation and growth environment for Hamilton has ended up becoming a technical labyrinth without clear exit. Ferrari has delivered updates that improve the car, for the wrong pilot. And in that paradox, one of the toughest episodes is being written in the career of a legend that hoped to close its cycle in the F1 at the level of its legacy. What happened in the Hungary Grand Prix should not be analyzed as a simple isolated episode within a complex season. It is, in reality, the most visible point of a silent fracture that has been expanding from the first preseason test. Hamilton's radio message was a confession, but also an accusation. It was the sound of a pilot who not only feels out of rhythm, but out of place. A pilot who no longer speaks the same language as his car, nor seems to be on the same page as his team. And that, in a sport as meticulously interdependent as Formula One, is a red alert. The question that is now floating in the air is not whether Hamilton can adapt, even if Ferrari can build something more in line with their needs. The real issue is whether there is mutual will to try. Because in the current Formula One, each race counts, each point is vital, and each tenth can define championships. There is no space for long adaptation processes. There is no time for repeated errors. And much less for worn relationships that are sustained only by contractual commitments or media expectations. Ferrari is at the usual crossroads, betting on the present or continuing to feed a story that no longer has solid technical basis. And Hamilton is facing one of the toughest decisions of his career: Continue to force an adaptation that can never come, or accept that this stage might not be the history of glory with which he dreamed of closing his legacy? Beyond the technical data, classification times, or car updates, what is at stake is the competitive identity of one of the greatest of all time. Can a champion like Hamilton allow to finish his career in frustration? Can Ferrari, a team that has always demanded perfection, allowing to build a car that does not work for one of the best pilots in history? And now I ask you, what do you think should happen? Is this the time for Hamilton to insist with Ferrari, demanding that the team take a complete technical turn around him? Or should I keep trying until you get the car?